It was well past midnight when Caitlin first glimpsed the silhouette of the old abandoned mansion on Blackwood Lane. The moon hung low, casting silver streaks across the cracked windows and warped wooden beams. A single crow perched on the sagging roof, its eyes reflecting the wavering glow of her lantern. A chill wind rustled the overgrown hedges, sending echoes through the house's hollow corridors. Though her heart pounded, Caitlin felt drawn forward, as though the house had whispered her name in the darkness. She gripped her coat tighter, wondering if the rumors of strange happenings had been more than mere gossip. When she was just a child, her grandmother had told her tales of this place, stories that spoke of ghosts wandering the halls, of widows in black dresses kneeling on dusty floors, weeping for lost loves. Caitlin used to imagine their forlorn cries drifting across time, too faint for normal ears. But now, as she stood before the towering facade, the house felt alive in an unsettling way. The front door, once painted a vibrant blue, had faded into a peeling slate, revealing layers of neglect. A gust of wind pushed it open slightly, creaking ominously as if beckoning her to enter. Caitlin hesitated on the threshold, unsure if crossing into the darkness would be wise. She sensed something intangible swirling around the property, a force older than any rumor. Stepping inside, she felt the wooden floorboards sag beneath her weight, groaning in protest. Dust motes danced in the stale air, illuminated by her flickering lantern. Each step echoed around her, amplifying her loneliness in the expansive foyer. She caught a glimpse of a grand staircase leading to the second floor, its banister warped and splintered. Despite her apprehension, she climbed, curiosity battling fear within her. At the top of the stairs, the corridor stretched into the shadows, lined with doors that seemed to stare back at her like vacant, hollow eyes. Faint moonlight filtered through a cracked skylight, casting shifting patterns across the dusty floor. She paused at the first door, pressing her ear against the cold wood. Silence, yet it wasn't comforting. It was a silence charged with potential, as though something lay in wait just beyond. Swallowing her nerves, she turned the knob slowly. The hinges screeched in protest, and her lantern cast a weak glow into the room, revealing furniture shrouded in white sheets. Like restless spirits, the sheets billowed in the draught. Caitlin stepped forward, brushing aside cobwebs that clung to the corners of the ceiling. Once a lavish bedroom, now it held only echoes of a life interrupted. A portrait of a solemn man in a dusty gilded frame stood on a mantel. His eyes seemed to follow her. Approaching the portrait, she saw the brass nameplate, Edgar Blackwood. She'd heard mention of the Blackwood family, rumored to have vanished after a series of gruesome incidents. Suddenly, the temperature in the room plummeted, and a whisper, barely audible, caressed her ear. "Leave." Terrified, Caitlin spun around, expecting to find someone behind her, but the room was empty. The door slammed shut. She could hear the frantic beating of her heart echoing in her ears. She didn't dare move as her breath caught in her throat. The whisper repeated, a soft exhale of warning. Gathering her courage, she flung the door open and darted back into the hallway. The temperature in the corridor felt normal, but she couldn't dismiss what she'd just heard, or felt. Perhaps she truly wasn't alone in the house. Perhaps the spirits that wandered Blackwood Lane were not merely stories. Undeterred by the eerie encounter, she ventured deeper into the mansion. Her mind buzzed with questions. What had happened to Edgar Blackwood, and why had the estate been left to rot in such a dismal state? With each step, floorboards groaned beneath her. An acrid smell lingered in the air, like burnt paper mixed with mold. She opened another door, leading into what seemed to be a study. Bookshelves lined the walls, many volumes strewn across the floor, pages torn and scattered. A once glorious desk stood in the center, its surface scarred as though someone had frantically carved into the wood. Curiosity propelled her to inspect the desk. She brushed away layers of dust to reveal strange, interlocking symbols carved into the surface. They resembled a web of arcane shapes and cryptic letters, entirely foreign to her. She remembered an old legend that Edgar had been involved in occult practices, seeking forbidden knowledge to bring back a lost loved one. A shiver coursed through her at the thought of meddling with such sinister powers. She rifled through the desk drawers, finding a journal with yellowed pages. Many entries were illegible, written in a frenzy, but one passage stood out, ominously circled in red. The passage read, "Shadows move beyond my control. She calls from beyond the veil and I must answer. Only through the ritual can I bridge the gulf." Caitlin's fingers trembled as she held the journal. Something told her this was more than obsession. She glanced at the date, over a century ago, yet the ink looked fresh as if it had been spilled just yesterday. Suddenly the door behind her creaked. She snapped the journal shut and spun around, half expecting to see Edgar himself. The doorway was empty, but a cold draft brushed past her, carrying the faintest of moans. She left the study, clutching the journal tightly under her arm. Every corridor seemed to stretch impossibly long, as though the house was shifting around her. The walls groaned and the doors loomed. Shadows flickered across the peeling wallpaper, seemingly alive. Descending to the first floor, she found a large dining hall. A grand chandelier dangled precariously from the ceiling, swaying in the stale air. Chairs were toppled around a massive table with rotting linen. Plates, half shattered, lay scattered on the floor. The disarray spoke of a sudden abandonment, as if those who had once dined here fled in haste. At the far end of the dining hall stood a portrait of a young woman in a pale dress. Beneath it, an inscription read, "Catherine Blackwood, beloved wife." Her features bore a striking resemblance to Caitlin's own face, sending a jolt of alarm through her. The woman's dark eyes seemed to plead from behind the canvas, and Caitlin felt a pang of sorrow she couldn't explain. She stepped closer, noticing the paint had cracked near the woman's eyes, giving the impression of tears. A soft hiss of wind rattled the glass windows, and Caitlin sensed that Catherine's story was the key. Determined to learn more, Caitlin moved toward the back of the house, where she discovered a narrow staircase leading down into a cellar. The wooden steps groaned with each footfall, the darkness below thick and foreboding. The air smelled of damp earth and decay. She reached the bottom and found herself in a low-ceilinged room lined with stone walls. Wine racks stood empty, their bottles long gone. A single candle stub flickered weakly on a table, an inexplicable sign that someone, or something, had been here recently. The flicker cast dancing shadows that seemed to twist into menacing shapes at the periphery of her vision. In the cellar's corner, she discovered another door, iron-banded and slightly ajar. Heart-pounding, she approached, her lantern casting a wavering light. Beyond lay a smaller chamber cluttered with crates and dusty boxes. In the center stood a makeshift altar draped with tattered cloth and surrounded by candles melted down to stubs. The symbols on the altar matched those carved into the study's desk, forming a spiral pattern around a small iron bowl. Within the bowl lay something black and crumbling, remnants of burned paper or perhaps something else entirely. An involuntary shudder racked her body as she realized the gravity of this discovery. She placed the journal on the altar, flipping through its pages again to see if there was a specific mention of the ritual site. The final entries were nearly illegible, full of scribbles and half-formed words, but one phrase repeated, "to bring her back." Over and over, Edgar had scrawled these words, sometimes etched so forcefully that the pages tore. Standing there, Caitlin could almost feel his desperation, his grief turned into obsession. If the legends were true, Edgar might have attempted to defy death itself, but such attempts always came with a price. A chill crept down her spine, a warning. A sudden crash from the main cellar yanked her attention away from the journal. She jumped, knocking the iron bowl to the floor. The echo reverberated around the small chamber. She raced back through the cellar door, her lantern trembling in her grasp. In the flickering light, she saw broken glass scattered across the floor, as though a bottle had been hurled against the wall. Yet no one was there. The cellar was silent save for Caitlin's ragged breathing. Adrenaline surged through her. Part of her wanted to flee immediately, but a stronger curiosity anchored her in place. She couldn't leave now. Caitlin mustered her courage and whispered, "Who's there?" Her voice sounded frail against the oppressive darkness. No response came, just a slight gust that made the lantern flame waver. She edged around the shattered glass and climbed the stairs back to the dining hall. The house felt alive, every timber resonating with an unseen pulse. She made her way to a smaller hidden doorway near the kitchen. Entering, she discovered a narrow corridor leading to servants' quarters. The cramped rooms were lined with simple cots, the bedding tattered and stained. Faint footprints in the dust suggested she wasn't the first to pass through recently. A door at the end stood ajar, revealing a cramped closet. Shelves were filled with rotting linens and old cleaning supplies. But something else caught her eye, a hidden panel in the wall. The panel was slightly misaligned, leaving a thin crack of light. She pushed it gently, and it swung open to reveal a secret passage. Inside, the walls were lined with candle brackets, their wax remnants dripping down like frozen tears. She stepped in, realizing the passage sloped downward, deeper beneath the foundation. The air felt thick, laden with an indefinable tension, as though she was crossing a boundary into forbidden territory. Her lantern cast shadows that seemed to dance on the stone walls. The corridor narrowed, forcing her to sidestep ancient cobwebs. She reached a heavy wooden door at the corridor's end, reinforced with black iron. It bore the same occult symbols she'd seen before. Reaching for the handle, she hesitated. Something behind the door exuded an aura of menace. Her heart thundered in her chest. Drawing in a shaking breath, she pulled the door open. The hinges screamed like tortured spirits. Lantern light revealed a wide chamber that seemed older than the rest of the house, carved directly into the earth. In the center of this chamber stood a large stone circle inscribed with runes that glimmered as though they had been recently traced with some luminous substance. Surrounding the circle were dozens of candle stubs, their wicks scorched. A battered wooden table stood at the edge, holding an open leather-bound book and a tarnished silver chalice. The atmosphere felt suffocating, as if the space itself was charged with sorrow and longing. Caitlin stepped forward carefully, her footfalls echoing. She could almost hear chanting in her mind, though the air was utterly still. She approached the table. The open book's pages depicted macabre illustrations, a figure standing at the center of a circle, arms raised to the sky, surrounded by swirling shadows. The text was a mixture of Latin and bizarre runic symbols. The chalice, stained dark inside, reeked of coppery residue. It didn't take much imagination to guess what might have been poured into it. She felt a surge of horror and pity. How far had Edgar gone in his quest to resurrect Catherine? The air prickled with an unseen energy, making her every nerve stand on end. Even the lantern flame sputtered nervously. Unable to stand the heavy oppression any longer, she turned to leave, but the door slammed shut with a deafening crash. Her lantern flickered and nearly went out. A frantic pulse pounded in her temples. She yanked on the handle, but it wouldn't budge, as though held by an invisible hand. Then an agonized moan echoed through the chamber. She froze, eyes wide in terror. The moan built into a wail that seemed to resonate from the walls themselves, an inhuman lament that spoke of deep anguish. The temperature plummeted, and her breath formed white clouds in the flickering light. A figure began to coalesce in the circle. Wispy at first, it gradually took shape, the outline of a tall man with hollow eyes. His face contorted in despair, arms reaching out as if pleading for release. Edgar? Caitlin's legs trembled, almost giving out beneath her. She held the lantern high, fighting the urge to drop it and run. The spirit's mouth moved, but no words emerged. Instead, Caitlin felt a pressure in her mind, a swirl of regret, heartbreak, and longing. She understood, on some primal level, that Edgar was trapped in this realm by the ritual he had performed. Summoning courage, she whispered, "I'm sorry." The spirit's eyes flickered with recognition. He gestured toward the book on the table, and she sensed that he wanted her to end whatever he had begun. But as she approached the altar, the runes on the floor glowed brighter, and the wailing intensified. The presence of another entity filled the chamber, a dark, wrathful force. The temperature dropped further. Frost crackled along the walls. "I'll fix this," she gasped, flipping frantically through the book's pages. She found a final ritual, a reversal, but the words were written in a twisted dialect she barely recognized. Her hands shook as she fumbled through the text. The malevolent presence pressed in, so heavy it felt like she was being smothered. Darkness gathered at the edges of her vision. She forced herself to speak the words anyway, pronouncing each syllable with as much certainty as she could muster. The room vibrated, the circle's runes pulsing in an eerie glow. The spirit of Edgar flickered, contorting as though caught in a storm of unseen energies. A piercing shriek reverberated through the room, 1,000 voices crying out in agony. Caitlin's throat constricted, and she feared her heart might stop from sheer terror. Yet she continued, chanting the reversal, feeling a strength that was not her own guide her tongue. The final words left her lips, and a deafening silence fell. The runes faded, the oppressive weight lifted. Edgar's form flickered one last time before dissolving into the air, his expression softening with gratitude. Caitlin dropped to her knees, lantern rattling on the stone floor. She could barely breathe, her body shaking from the ordeal. The door, freed from whatever force had held it, creaked open. A stale breeze crept in, carrying the slightest hint of fresh night air. Stumbling out of the chamber, she managed to navigate the passage back up to the main floor. The house seemed different now, still decrepit but no longer throbbing with malevolence. She found her way to the front door, pushed it open, and stepped into the cold, moonlit night. Her chest heaved with relief. Shadows of the old mansion stretched across the overgrown yard, and the crow that had perched on the roof was nowhere to be seen. For a long moment she stood there, trembling, until she felt the first rays of dawn approach, chasing away the haunting darkness. In the days that followed, Caitlin returned to her grandmother's home, determined to lay the memory of Blackwood Lane to rest. She burned the journal, scattering the ashes in a flowing river, hoping to wash away the lingering sorrow. Sometimes at night she thought she heard whispers in the wind, but they no longer frightened her. She sensed that Edgar and Catherine were finally at peace, freed from the twisted ritual that had imprisoned them. Though she never again set foot in that mansion, a part of her would always remember the night she confronted the shadows of the past. Years later, curious thrill-seekers would explore the decrepit mansion, searching for ghosts. They might glimpse a flicker of movement in the corners or hear faint cries echoing through the corridors. But the darkest force had been lifted, and the restless souls of the Blackwoods no longer roamed in torment. The house on Blackwood Lane remained a relic of tragedy, creaking in the wind, offering cautionary tales to those who might be tempted by forbidden knowledge. And though Caitlin's encounter felt like a distant nightmare, she knew the echoes of grief could still linger in places where the walls kept memories of the dead. Whenever she recalled that harrowing night, she remembered the frailty of the boundary between life and death, love and despair. The mansion, with its empty rooms and hidden chambers, symbolized the lengths one might go for longing and loss. Even now, she sometimes woke from dreams of moonlit corridors and a distant voice calling her name. But in those dreams she no longer ran in terror. Instead, she stood firm, lantern held high, a quiet guardian for those who needed release from whatever haunted them. In her heart, the creaking house on Blackwood Lane would forever remain a haunting testament to a love that defied death, and a warning of the cost of such defiance. Mia always felt a strange pull toward Lake Everstill, a sprawling body of water hidden deep within a lonely forest. Locals claimed it was bottomless, its depths a dark mirror that no diver could fully explore. From the shore, the lake looked serene, its surface reflecting the surrounding pines and rocky hills with perfect clarity. Yet beneath that reflective calm lurked a mystery that tugged at Mia's imagination like a hook. She had heard rumors, whispered tales of unexplained lights drifting across the water at dusk, and voices echoing just beneath the waves. As the sun set one crisp autumn evening, she stood at the edge, determined to uncover whatever lurked in the shadows beneath the lake. Growing up, Mia had listened to the elders talk about an entire village that once occupied the region. They spoke of a time before the dam flooded the valley, submerging homes and roads under the rising water. When she was a child, she used to imagine the drowned buildings standing silent and forlorn beneath the surface, ghosts of a forgotten era. Now an adult, she clutched a flashlight in one hand and a camera in the other. The fading sunlight cast a golden glow over the lake, but an unease gnawed at her as she recalled stories of restless spirits wandering those submerged ruins. She paddled out in a small rowboat, the rhythmic creak of the oars mingling with the soft lapping of water against the hull. Mia's eyes scanned the expanse, searching for any sign of the rumored lights. The chilly breeze rustled through the pines, carrying the scent of damp earth. A thick fog crept across the lake's surface, forming ghostly shapes that twisted and merged in the twilight. She felt her heart flutter at every ripple, every swirl that bumped against the sides of the boat. A sliver of moon rose over the treetops, illuminating the fog with an otherworldly radiance. Mid-lake she paused and let the boat drift. The silence weighed on her, broken only by the distant hoot of an owl. A faint glow flickered in the corner of her vision. Her heart leapt as she peered into the mist. At first it looked like a lantern bobbing gently. She fumbled for her camera, but the glow vanished before she could snap a picture. A chill dripped down her spine, she had seen something, she was sure of it. She rowed closer to where the light had appeared, nerves humming with anticipation. An unseen current tugged at her, leading her deeper. Without warning, a sudden force rocked the boat, nearly tossing her overboard. Water splashed violently. She scrambled to regain her balance, breath ragged in her chest. Fear clamped her stomach in a vice, but she forced herself to remain calm. Her flashlight beam pierced the fog, revealing only dark water. After a tense moment, the lake settled once more as though nothing had happened. Mia's mind raced with possibilities. Could it have been a large fish? A submerged tree trunk? But she couldn't shake the feeling that something out there had deliberately tested her resolve, hinting that she was not welcome. Undeterred, she continued rowing until she reached a spot rumored to be directly above the old village square. She dropped a small anchor and leaned over the boat's edge, aiming her flashlight into the water. The beam penetrated only a few feet before dissolving into blackness. She adjusted her camera, attaching it to a pole for underwater footage. Lowering it carefully, she hoped the lens could capture something of the drowned buildings below. The temperature of the water stung her hand and she quickly drew back. Even with the thick protective casing, she felt the weight of the depths pulling on the camera. As she reviewed the live feed on her small screen, her stomach knotted. Murky outlines slid past. Rock formations or possibly the roofs of submerged structures. Her pulse quickened when she spotted what might have been a window frame, covered in algae. Then, just for an instant, something glided across the camera's view, a pale shape that disappeared almost immediately. She froze, rewinding the footage, but the shape was too fleeting. Still, she was certain she had seen a face peering back at her, a human-like contour, followed by the swirl of dark hair. Her hands trembled as she realized she was likely not alone. Night deepened and the fog thickened, wrapping the lake in a suffocating embrace. Mia's lantern cast a lonely glow, revealing slivers of water before vanishing into the mist. She pulled out a thermos for warmth, sipping hot coffee to steady her nerves. The surface of the lake was eerily calm now, as though it waited in anticipation. She thought back to local legends, tales of apparitions rising from the depths, searching for the lives they once knew. Some claimed the drowned villagers never found peace, their souls trapped under the water's weight. Mia tried to dismiss the stories as superstition, but unease gnawed at her resolve. Suddenly, an ethereal, shimmering light manifested about 20 feet from her boat. It flickered like a silent lantern floating on invisible waves. Mia held her breath, switching her camera to night vision. The glowing orb bobbed closer, revealing vague outlines as it pulsed in and out of view. Slowly, it drifted around her boat as if inspecting this intruder. She caught glimpses of ripples in the water beneath it, as though something swam below. Heart pounding, she recorded the phenomenon, the camera's lens capturing every flicker. In her excitement, she barely noticed how the temperature plummeted further, a creeping cold that seized her muscles. The orb paused, and for a moment, Mia felt a wave of sadness wash over her, a sorrow that seemed to radiate from the light itself. Tears pricked her eyes unexpectedly. She couldn't explain why, but she sensed longing, regret, and a desperate need. Then, just as silently, the orb sank beneath the surface. Mia rushed to the side of the boat, camera angled downward, but the water remained opaque. The feeling of sadness lingered, and she wondered if the spirit of some lost soul had reached out to her, hoping for deliverance. Steadying her ragged breathing, she decided to return to shore, convinced she'd captured enough evidence for one night. Back on land, Mia reviewed the footage. The orb's pulsating glow was visible, albeit faint. She replayed the moment it sank, slowing the frames. There, an instant where a face appeared within the orb, its expression twisted in silent anguish. Mia's heart pounded. She wondered how the rest of the world would respond to such a revelation. Yet something made her hesitate to share it widely. It felt too personal, as though she'd intruded on a sorrowful realm not meant for spectacle. She slept fitfully, haunted by the memory of that spectral glow and the sadness it had conveyed. The next day, curiosity overcame fear. Determined to learn more, Mia visited the town library, seeking records of the flooded village. Old newspapers detailed how the government had built a dam decades ago, forcing residents to relocate. The articles mentioned a tragic incident, a group of villagers who refused to leave, hoping to preserve their ancestral land. When the dam was completed, the waters rose too quickly, cutting off escape routes. Many drowned. Their remains were never recovered, lost in the submerged ruins. Mia's chest tightened at the thought of those who had been trapped, their final cries muffled by the merciless tide. She found a photograph of one such family, a mother, father, and young daughter, posed in front of a small wooden home. The mother's dark hair flowed in waves, and her large eyes seemed too somber for such a portrait. Mia recalled the pale shape glimpsed by her underwater camera, a shape that might have been a woman's face. The mother's name was Elise Brandt, rumored to be among those who fought to remain. Mia wondered if the restless spirit beneath the lake belonged to Elise, searching for her child even in death. Driven by a need to offer closure, Mia decided to return to Lake Everstill. This time, she brought flowers as a sign of respect, and a plan to dive if the conditions allowed. She arranged for a small diving expedition with a local guide named Colin, who had grown up hearing stories of the submerged village. Colin was skeptical of ghosts but intrigued by her findings. On a crisp morning, they loaded diving gear into a motorized boat, heading to the same spot Mia had anchored before. The lake's surface was placid, the sky overcast, an eerie hush blanketing the surroundings. Once they reached the designated area, Mia and Colin donned their suits and eased into the frigid water. The cold seeped through the neoprene, a blunt reminder of the unforgiving depths. Armed with underwater flashlights, they descended into a realm of drifting silt and silent darkness. Visibility was poor. The beams revealed only small pockets of clarity amid the murk. Mia's breath rattled in her regulator, her nerves on edge. Colin gestured for her to follow, his expression tense. Bit by bit, the silhouettes of submerged rooftops emerged, a tableau of ghostly structures on the lake's bottom. They swam through what appeared to be the remains of a cobblestone street, half buried in sludge. Wooden beams jutted from the mud, the remnants of door frames and collapsed walls. A battered sign dangled from a post, unreadable but still stubbornly standing. Mia's heart pounded with each fin stroke, both terrified and awestruck by this underwater graveyard. She felt the oppressive weight of history around her. As they rounded a corner of a submerged building, she noticed a faint glimmer in the distance. Colin saw it too, shining like a distant star in a black sky. They approached cautiously, flashlights aimed. The glow took shape, a pale figure drifting between two ruined walls. Mia's pulse surged as she recognized the ghostly outline of a woman with flowing hair, her face obscured. Colin froze, disbelief etched into his features. The specter seemed to regard them briefly, then drifted away into the gloom. Mia followed instinctively, ignoring Colin's frantic signals to stay together. The figure led her through a labyrinth of submerged debris, deeper into the watery darkness. Mia's lungs tightened with every kick, her heart hammering in her chest. At last, the figure halted before what might have once been a modest house. Its roof had collapsed and half the walls were gone, but a doorway remained upright, stoic in the aquatic gloom. The spectral woman hovered near the threshold, raising a translucent arm as if inviting Mia to enter. Mia glanced around for Colin but saw only swirling silt. Summoning her courage, she slipped through the doorway, shining her flashlight over algae-covered furniture and shattered remains of a life long past. A child's doll, half buried in sediment, stared blindly from the floor, its once bright paint peeling away. A sudden surge of emotion crashed into Mia, a wave of maternal grief and desperation. She nearly dropped her flashlight, fighting to keep her breathing steady. The ghostly figure pointed toward a corner of the room. Mia followed the gesture, spotting something half buried in the silt. She reached down, her glove brushing something metallic. Gently she tugged it free, a small locket tarnished and caked with mud. Inside she found a faded photograph of a young girl who looked eerily like the child in the library photo. Mia felt tears welling in her mask, the water growing hazy around her eyes. The figure moved closer, her features becoming clearer in the faint glow. She resembled Elise Brandt, the mother from the photograph. Mia could sense heartbreak emanating from her, a longing that transcended death. Holding the locket, Mia felt an unspoken plea to bring it back to the surface, to ensure that the memory of this lost child wasn't forgotten. Before Mia could react further, a violent current swept through the house, stirring clouds of debris. The spirit vanished, leaving only the locket in Mia's trembling hand. Colin appeared moments later, eyes wide with alarm, gesturing for them to ascend. Breaking the surface, Mia gasped for air, her heart still thundering. Colin ripped off his mask, sputtering a stream of expletives, demanding to know what she had seen. She simply held up the locket. Colin's skepticism wavered when he realized she had found it in a place no ordinary diver would have dared enter alone. The ride back to shore was tense, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Mia felt as though she carried part of Elise's sorrow with her. The heavier that sorrow felt, the more determined she became to honor the dead. That evening, Mia cleaned the locket meticulously, revealing a small inscription on the back, "For my precious daughter Lillian." She clutched the keepsake, recalling the stories of those who drowned rather than abandoned the only home they'd ever known. A numb emptiness settled over her. She realized that sometimes the dead sought closure, a final reconciliation with the living world. Armed with this conviction, she decided to organize a memorial at the lakeside, inviting the local community to acknowledge the lost village and pay respects to its victims. She hoped that in doing so, she might offer the spirits a measure of peace. Word spread quickly, fueled by both curiosity and empathy. On a brisk afternoon a week later, people gathered at the shore. Old-timers who remembered the dam's construction, younger residents who'd grown up hearing ghost stories, and families drawn by the mystery. Mia spoke about the historical tragedy, reading excerpts from old newspaper accounts. She held up the locket, explaining its significance. A hush fell over the crowd as she recounted the underwater encounter, describing the sorrow etched on the spirit's face. Many wept silently, touched by the realization that real families had been torn apart beneath these placid waters. As twilight descended, participants lit candles, placing them at the water's edge. Soft golden flames mirrored themselves in the lake, creating a constellation of light on the surface. A local pastor offered a short prayer, and others shared memories passed down from grandparents. The air was thick with collective mourning, yet there was solace in the communal act of remembrance. Mia gently placed the locket on a small raft adorned with flowers. She pushed it onto the lake, watching as it drifted away, guided by the gentle ripples. The candles flickered in the dusk, a fragile beacon of warmth in the encroaching darkness. A hush fell over the gathering when, to their amazement, several faint lights appeared across the lake. They glowed softly, akin to will-o'-the-wisps dancing on the water's surface. Gasps and whispers filled the air. Mia felt her eyes fill with tears again as the lights slowly converged near the floating raft. It was as if the spirits had come to accept the tribute, acknowledging the long-awaited remembrance. For a few moments, the lights hovered, their radiance gentle and sorrowful. Then, one by one, they vanished beneath the surface, leaving the lake once more in peaceful silence. In the days that followed, sightings of mysterious lights on Lake Everstill diminished. Locals remarked that the lake felt somehow lighter, as though a centuries-old burden had been lifted. Some claimed the water's clarity improved, revealing glimpses of submerged rooftops under the right conditions. Mia continued her research, documenting first-hand accounts of the phenomenon, even interviewing Colin, who spoke reluctantly about the ghostly figure they had encountered. Though he tried to rationalize it, the awe in his voice was undeniable. Mia's final act was to erect a small monument near the shore, engraved with the names of those known to have perished in the flood. She included a simple epitaph for Elise and Lillian Brandt, so their bond would never be forgotten. During the unveiling, a gentle breeze rippled across the water, carrying a sense of hushed gratitude. Many believed it to be a sign that the departed had found a measure of rest, their longing assuaged by the living's acknowledgement. Others remained skeptical, dismissing the lights as natural illusions, but the emotional weight of that day could not be denied. Although Mia occasionally felt the lingering sadness of Lake Everstill, she also sensed an undercurrent of peace whenever she visited. She would stand at the monument, gazing at the silent water, and sometimes imagine the drowned village below, a testament to resilience and tragedy both. In her quieter moments, she recalled the spirit's silent plea and felt comfort in knowing she had done what she could to honor their memory. The lake would never be just a lake to her now, it was a resting place, a keeper of secrets, and a reminder that the past must not be forgotten. Time passed, and new legends emerged about Lake Everstill, stories of how once there were restless spirits, but they had found their release thanks to a compassionate stranger who cared enough to remember them. Children grew up hearing bedtime tales of glowing lights that guided lost souls home, weaving Mia's act of remembrance into local folklore. Tourists still came, drawn by the mystery, but they found a peaceful serenity rather than the haunted oppression that once tainted the waters. Life and death coexisted quietly, balanced by the power of simple compassion. Mia would never forget the chill of the deep or the ghostly face that looked back at her from the underwater gloom. Every so often, she dreamed of drifting through submerged streets, guided by a faint lantern that led her to a small house where a mother and child were finally reunited. In those dreams there was no fear, only a profound sense of understanding and closure. Awake, she took comfort in the knowledge that healing, even for the dead, was possible when the living dared to witness their grief. And in that gentle acceptance, the shadows beneath the lake began to fade. Alina had always been sensitive to the whispers of nature. She grew up near an ancient forest known as Briarwood Grove, a place of towering oaks and twisted thickets that few dared to enter after sundown. For centuries, rumors persisted that the forest was alive in a way that defied explanation. Hikers would speak of unnerving rustles that seemed to follow them, of unknown eyes glimmering in the undergrowth. Even the local wildlife seemed apprehensive of certain clearings. As a child, Alina dismissed these stories as tall tales designed to keep children from wandering off. Yet one autumn evening she learned how real the forest's secrets could be. She was 17 when her best friend, Tom, vanished during a weekend camping trip in Briarwood Grove. A massive search ensued, involving police dogs and volunteer groups combing the trails. They found no trace of Tom, no footprints, no gear, nothing but a single sneaker snagged on a fallen branch. As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, hope dwindled. Alina was devastated, unable to accept that her friend could simply disappear without a trace. She vowed to return one day, to search the places the official teams might have overlooked, determined to uncover the truth behind Tom's disappearance. Years later, she finally mustered the courage to go back. Now in her early 20s, Alina embarked on a personal quest armed with a map, a flashlight, and an unshakable conviction that the forest still held Tom's story. The first day of her trek was unremarkable. She followed a well-worn path, the canopy high above letting through dappled sunlight. Rust-colored leaves crackled underfoot, and squirrels darted along the branches. Despite her memories, she felt at peace initially, as though the forest was trying to lull her into a false sense of security. She set up camp in a small clearing that night, falling asleep to the distant hooting of owls. But as darkness pressed in, subtle changes stirred the atmosphere. Tree trunks assumed warped shapes in the moonlight, their gnarled silhouettes resembling silent sentinels. A low wind hissed through the foliage, almost whispering Alina's name. She awoke in a cold sweat, haunted by a dream of Tom's face staring at her from behind a lattice of branches. In the dream, he'd raised a hand in warning, his voice lost in a swirl of dead leaves. She couldn't shake the feeling that the forest itself was trying to communicate something, but whether it was a warning or a summons she couldn't say. The next morning she ventured deeper off-trail, guided by intuition more than the map. The forest grew denser, the light dimmer. Moss and lichen clung to the trunks, draping them in green-gray shrouds. A sense of unease coiled in her stomach, as though she were trespassing on sacred ground. Every so often she'd catch a flicker of motion from the corner of her eye, branches shifting without wind, a fleeting silhouette. The feeling of being watched intensified, prickling the back of her neck. She tried to dismiss the sensation as paranoia, but the forest felt almost sentient, following her progress with silent curiosity. In the late afternoon, she discovered a peculiar clearing littered with stones arranged in concentric circles. At the center stood an ancient oak tree, its trunk bearing strange markings carved into the bark, symbols older than any she'd seen. A hush enveloped the area as if all creatures held their breath. Alina's pulse quickened. She thought of Tom, of how he might have stumbled upon such a place. Suddenly, a rustling in the bushes made her spin around. Her flashlight beam caught a brief glimpse of a gaunt figure, impossibly thin, vanishing behind a cluster of ferns. Alina's heart pounded. She called out, but no reply came. Nerves on edge, she approached the ancient oak. The carvings seemed to depict twisted faces merging with leaves and branches, forming a tapestry of nature and humanity fused in eerie harmony. She felt a tremor beneath her feet, as though the roots extended deeper than she could imagine, pulsing with the forest's lifeblood. A memory tugged at her mind, old legends of the Green Man or guardian spirits said to dwell in hidden groves. But these carvings held a darker quality, more predatory than protective. Unsure what to believe, Alina circled the tree carefully, searching for any clue that might link to Tom. She found a weather-beaten scrap of cloth caught on a protruding root, possibly from a backpack or shirt. Her heart leapt. Could it be Tom's? She crouched to examine it, and that was when she noticed footprints in the soft soil. They were faint, the edges blurred, but they looked human. They led away from the oak and into a denser thicket. Fear and hope battled within her. Following footprints in a place where none should exist might be her best chance to find answers. Gritting her teeth, she pressed on, pushing through brambles that clawed at her clothes and skin. As twilight descended, the forest underwent a transformation. The branches overhead knitted tightly, forming a near-impenetrable canopy that plunged the undergrowth into darkness. Alina's flashlight cast wavering beams across twisted roots and thick vines. At times she could hear footsteps echoing hers, always just out of sight. The air grew thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. Soft whispers drifted through the darkness, shaping words she couldn't decipher. Heart hammering, she pressed forward until she stumbled into another clearing dominated by an enormous, blackened stump. The atmosphere here was suffocating, tinged with an ancient malice that set her nerves ablaze. In the center of the stump's surface lay a scattering of small bones, animal, she hoped, but her stomach churned at the possibility they might be human. Around the clearing, the trees loomed in a ring, each trunk bearing a single carved face. The expressions were grotesque, mouths agape in silent screams. Alina felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. She wanted to run, but some inexplicable force rooted her in place, compelling her to confront whatever lurked in this forsaken place. Then she saw it again, the gaunt figure from before, emerging from the shadows. It seemed taller now, limbs elongating in the half-light, features obscured by swirling darkness. The figure's eyes were two gleaming points of pale light. It extended a bony arm, beckoning Alina closer. Though every instinct screamed at her to flee, she inched forward, pulled by a haunting familiarity in its stance. Its voice, when it spoke, was little more than a rasp, yet somehow she recognized Tom's timbre beneath the distortion. "Help me," it hissed, an echo that reverberated with uncanny resonance. Tears stung Alina's eyes. Was this truly Tom, transformed by the forest's grasp? Or was this an entity wearing his face like a puppet? Fear warred with love, confusion with resolve. Summoning her courage, she asked, "Tom, is that you?" In response, the figure trembled, raising its other arm to reveal a ragged piece of fabric clutched in its claw-like fingers. It matched the cloth she'd found earlier. Alina felt her heart twist painfully. She approached cautiously, her flashlight illuminating the gaunt face, which flickered between Tom's boyish features and something more ancient, more malevolent. "The forest took me," he choked out, voice cracking as though torn from multiple throats. "It hungers." Alina's throat tightened. All the stories she'd heard about this cursed grove crashed into her mind, each more horrifying than the last. She realized that the forest was not just a collection of trees, but a living force that consumed lost souls. Tom had been caught, ensnared by its hunger for life, forced to wander its depths as a twisted husk. "I won't leave you," she murmured, tears streaming down her cheeks. But Tom's form shuddered, as though battling an unseen current. He managed a frail whisper, "Run." A monstrous groan reverberated through the clearing, the ring of carved faces seeming to writhe in the flickering light. Roots erupted from the ground, coiling like serpents around Alina's ankles. She screamed and jerked free, stumbling back. The figure that might have been Tom let out a mournful cry, reaching out imploringly. The forest floor trembled and the massive stump cracked open, emitting a foul stench. Alina's mind reeled as she saw glimpses of a pulsating mass of roots and tendrils beneath the stump, like the beating heart of a malevolent entity. The carved faces on the surrounding trees distorted further, their mouths stretching in silent howls. A wave of nausea threatened to overwhelm her. Alina swung her flashlight wildly, searching for an escape route. With a surge of adrenaline, she bolted toward a gap between two oaks, ignoring the brambles that tore at her legs. Behind her, she heard the figure shriek, a sound that mixed sorrow and rage. She dared not look back, terrified of what she might see. Branches whipped her arms, and the forest seemed to shift, rearranging paths to confuse her. She kept running, guided by flashes of moonlight and sheer desperation, until at last she stumbled onto a familiar trail. Gasping for breath, she collapsed beside a fallen log, heart pounding as though it would burst from her chest. The forest was quieter here, the looming malevolence receding. Alina dared to look over her shoulder, half expecting to see the elongated figure pursuing her. But she was alone. Gradually her ragged breathing eased. She felt a soul-crushing guilt for leaving Tom behind, yet she knew in her bones that whatever he had become was no longer truly human. The forest had claimed him. Still, she refused to abandon hope entirely. Maybe there was a way to free him. She needed knowledge, help from those who understood the ancient forces at work. Summoning her remaining strength, she made for the nearest exit she could find. She emerged from Briarwood Grove just before dawn, collapsing into the arms of a startled park ranger. Her story poured out in disjointed fragments, of carved trees, monstrous stumps, and a gaunt figure wearing Tom's face. The ranger looked skeptical, but the terror in her eyes was undeniable. After ensuring she received medical attention, he promised to alert the proper authorities for another search. Alina knew their efforts would be futile if they approached this forest as though it were merely land and timber. The evil lurking within was ancient, cunning, and far beyond conventional understanding. Weeks passed and Alina's nightmares worsened. She dreamt of Tom beckoning her from within the twisted depths, his voice calling her name beneath a moonless sky. Every morning she woke drenched in sweat, the echo of rustling leaves haunting her. She consulted old folklore experts and pored over dusty texts about nature spirits and cursed groves. Yet nothing offered a clear solution. The guilt gnawed at her. She couldn't rid herself of the image of Tom's anguished eyes. The forest still had him, and she felt an obligation to return, no matter how terrifying the prospect. Exhausted but resolute, Alina emerged, clutching the remains of Tom's essence within her heart. Though their fates were bound to the forest's ancient will, she believed a final flicker of hope still existed. Steeled by the truth, she vowed to bravely return once more, determined to finally break nature's dark enchantment.